Welcome back to, or actually, well, first of all, let's go ahead and, I'm so used to wearing it at this point because just trying to make sure everybody stays safe and whatnot, but welcome to the Downstairs Fine Arts Teachers Lounge, but also just because my room's being used right now, but also welcome to your first flipped lesson. Welcome to Western Civilizations, Honors Western Civilizations, and your new flipped classroom, right? So again, big essence thing to this is your very first flip. All you have to do is take notes on this video, much like you would if it was like an in-class lecture, and then you're going to show me those notes when we have class again, which you guys is going to be tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, you'll show me those notes tomorrow, and then you'll use them to answer warm-up questions, and then we'll review, and it's just kind of a quid pro quo, like give and take kind of existence, and we're basically just flipping the traditional model around. You're doing stuff that you would sometimes rather be doing at, or not rather be, but sometimes actually be doing for homework, like section review questions. We're just doing those in class and reviewing them together. And this great model offers us the ability to go way more in depth and offer you that honors-like quality and speed, which is what we're looking for. All right, so let's go ahead and get started though. Let's kind of just dive right in talking about Western civilizations. What is that? All right, so a lot of y'all probably have immediately seen the Western Civilizations course description on your schedule, and you're immediately like, well, why isn't it just called world history? Why isn't it just called, like, you know, world cultures or whatever? Because it's not what it is. What this class truly is a study of Western civilizations and their direct impact on the world. And what a Western civilization is, just to give you a heads up, go ahead and jot this down, is considered as being a civilization that stems from the Mediterranean Sea and kind of emits outward, mostly encompassing Europe, okay, and its effect on the rest of the world throughout time. Right? For example, let's talk about us as people, right? Is there any reason why me, a European descendant person, is supposed to be standing on Louisiana territory right now if Western civilizations did not play out the way that it did? No, I have English, Scotch, Irish, and German ancestry, right? I should be back technically by my cultures in Europe, but due to the impact of Western civilizations, colonization, and the eventual American revolutionary progress, now, boom, we have Louisiana. Also, Louisiana Purchase, mainly, just because keying that one in there. Oh, Robert Livingston. He was only supposed to buy New Orleans, just bought a third of the country. Now, going into it, though, just so you understand, this is kind of what Western civilizations is, right? And let's go ahead and kind of like define, like, where's the West, right? Because the West isn't necessarily geographical. It's more like ideological, right? So when we say the West, what do we actually mean when we say the West? Well, it's particularly we're talking about European history more so than not, and also the entire history timeline stemming mostly from the ancient Greeks being our marker, right? Being our earliest true Western civilization, and then lurching forward, right? So the big thing about defining the West culturally, though, if we're going to define the West culturally, we're talking about three particular kind of defining key characteristics of a Western civilization. First and foremost, we have a free and participatory government, right? That means that we have a government that encompasses democratic ideals, usually, including things like voting, public office, and that it is technically free to the public to be able to participate in those public offices or able to necessarily try to represent themselves through different democratic processes. Then we also believe we have like religious toleration, kind of a little bit more of a ubiquitous toleration of other religions and kind of an understanding of that there is a plethora of different religions in a certain area, right? And then the other big factor about the Western civilization is capitalism, right? The Western civilizations are typically defined by having capitalist style economics, right? Capitalism being letting the governance of supply, demand, and competition regulate the prices of objects and also pushing innovation in certain technological fields in the pursuit of making money, right? So that's kind of your capitalistic tendencies, right? Now, really, really quickly, though, keep going forward. Sorry, sometimes I got to click on that. There you go. Now, defining the West geographically, though, we are looking more of a tradition, this is what we talked about earlier, a tradition beginning around the Mediterranean Sea, and it's going to spend centuries as a European developing ideal. All right, so starting in Europe and kind of fostering itself throughout Europe, and then it's eventually going to permeate and spread all over the world, right? When Europeans find a technological leap forward in the 1400s and they kind of surpass a lot of the other cultures throughout the world, they start to kind of spread their ideas, mainly through this process known as cultural diffusion, but also imperialism, hypernationalism, other things like that. But we'll get into that stuff later on, okay? So again, we're kind of sticking to this idea of like the West. Well, what is the West? Well, the West is like a kind of controversial idea. The West isn't necessarily just European in its effects. It's not necessarily just everybody has always been a Western civilization or is an Eastern civilization, because that's the duality of it. You have Western civilizations and Eastern civilizations, which we'll kind of get into that discussion a little bit more tomorrow, kind of separating those two things apart and kind of understanding like, well, what qualifies a Western civilization? What qualifies an Eastern civilization? What makes these things different? Well, the West is a little bit of a controversial idea because I did just tell you that it is about a free and participatory government. It is based around religious toleration, and it's also based around capitalism. But the issue with the West is that it has had markers that are kind of contradictory to those like standards, right? Because we've had the presence of slavery and freedom of others at the exact same time, because that kind of doesn't fit that religious toleration ideal set. However, it does fit the capitalism ideal set, right? So that's a little bit of a given, like not a give and take, but it's kind of that hypocritical, controversial idea of the West, right? Then also women historically in Western civilizations have fewer rights, right? Now, so you can't necessarily hold up the West as the bannerment of all progress ever. It has its dark sides. It has its duality, right? And then also you have this massive split. Capitalism is great, yes, but it also creates a massive gap between the wealthy and the impoverished, right? So the West is kind of an idea where it's like it's good and it can be bad. Eastern civilizations can be good and bad, right? Big thing to understand is that there's no perfect system because the West has its controversial ideas, and it also has its kind of defining key ideas that make it a positive experience. And don't write this, and it also presents like a paradox, right? Because it's a little weird. Like Western civilizations began, ironically enough, today in what is considered Iraq. But most people would consider Iraq today to be an Eastern-style culture. Well, today Japan, which started out as an Eastern-style culture, is now considered Western after the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s. And during the Cold War, Turkey is technically Western, but Libya is further west of Turkey, but is considered Eastern. So you understand what I'm saying? So it's not necessarily a perfect definition, all right? Calling something a Western civilization is not a perfect definition, and calling something an Eastern civilization is not a perfect definition, especially in today's era, right? It's both economically and politically, all right? So all things considered, when we're talking about the West, we're mainly talking about the birth of civilization. Not so much that is the West, but we're talking about the birth of civilization in Southwest Asia, and then eventually the birth of civilization in Europe, and then this progressive historical impact of that civilization birth out of ancient Greece, and kind of what kept the ball rolling forward and their direct impact on the rest of the world, right? So now, anyway, continuing to go forward though. And what is a civilization? So we know what the West is, right? We've just kind of defined like the West being capitalist and being religiously tolerant, free and participatory government. That's the West. Well, what's a civilization then? What is that, right? Well, the word civilization itself comes from a Latin root, which means civ, which stands for citizen or member of a society, and civitas, which means city, right? So civilization appears to be a very crucial part of this idea of civilization. So city, civilization, right? A grouping or collective of human beings, okay? So civilization is important to understand simply because it can't necessarily be perfectly defined. Because actually when you're looking at the grand scheme of civilizations, you could technically be anywhere between a band, a tribe, a chiefdom, a state, right? You have all these different things that could be considered a civilization. So what technically qualifies anything as a civilization? How do we know where to start? Well, mainly we know where to start due to the fact that cities emerge mainly as a result of what is called the Neolithic Revolution. Okay, so let's take a back step real quick, okay? There are two eras of history. Stop writing. I need you to write this over in the margins or take a second to write this and then write all this stuff down. But there are two eras of history. You have the Paleolithic period, right? Paleolithic, right? So let me double check, making sure. Yep. All right, so the Paleolithic period, that word having Latin origins as well means old, paleo meaning old, and lithic means Stone Age, right? Now the Paleolithic period ranges anywhere from 4,000 BC to 8,000 BC, okay? Now let's talk about the Paleolithic period for a second. I'm going to take this away just so you're not tempted to write it, okay? The Paleolithic period is the era of hunter-gatherers, right? That is the era of undeveloped human-structured groupings, right? Hunter-gatherer, bands of hunter-gatherers that would actually not live in one place because they were, good job, Riley, that is exactly right, they were nomadic, right? Nomads or nomadic people move from place to place to find food, right? If me, Mr. Mathern, and Mr. Wooderson were a nomadic band of Paleolithic, like, cavemen, I hate the word cavemen because it's so derivative and it's not historically accurate whatsoever, but still, if we were nomadic, we would move around constantly to find food, to hunt game, to actually gather different supplies so our group could stay alive, right? That's Paleolithic. Mainly starting with the group, Paleolithic period begins to end when a group of people arises known as Homo sapiens sapiens, all right? And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But so Paleolithic period is that hunter-gatherer area. But then the Neolithic period begins, all right? Now, you could see very important things arising in a little bit, but we'll get there in a second. The Neolithic period occurs anywhere between 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, give or take, right around 8,000 BC in Mesopotamia and Egypt, right? Now, Mesopotamia being a word you've probably heard before, but maybe don't necessarily remember where it is. And then Egypt is definitely a thing you've heard of before, but geographically may not know exactly where it is. Now, this revolution, this Neolithic revolution, because Neolithic means new Stone Age. Neo, new, lithic, Stone Age. This revolution is going to revolve around the key construction of one particular thing. Farming, right? So farming, this agricultural revolution, is going to lead to the farming, the domestication of animals, and the biggest thing out of all of them, the creation of a surplus, right? Surpluses are very important. A surplus is an excess of material used for survival. So let's say hypothetically me, Mr. Mathern, and Mr. Wooderson actually went from being a Paleolithic group to a Neolithic group, right? And we went from Paleolithic to Neolithic. It means that we learned how to farm, right? And if we learned how to farm, it means we're creating a surplus, right? I would be the farmer in the group because I'm the biggest and the strongest out of all of us, obviously. Now, anyway, the big thing about it is, though, is I would be farming more than I need. I'd be farming enough to feed them. But if I'm farming and feeding them, then what are they going to do all day? They're going to do something really, really important. And it's going to lead to another era, another idea of civilization, right? Because when you begin to extract food from arid regions surrounding great rivers, that demands the use of social cohesion, right? There's got to be a cooperation there. Hello. Hey, where are y'all? So there has to be, no, you're good. There has to be there has to be a social cohesion, right? That means that we have to have different individuals that are all actually working together in a unit-like group, right? So as I'm farming, creating this surplus for all of us, Mr. Mathern and Mr. Wooderson would then probably become what is known as an artisan, right? They're going to become a specialized worker. They're going to become a thing like a blacksmith, a potter, a carter, a tanner, which is somebody who makes leather or textiles at the time, right? So that gives them time to specialize in a job, right? So this leads eventually to social stratification and organized governments, right? This cohesion of people. Social stratification being social classes and different hierarchies. Organized government, of course, meaning leaders of a certain area throughout time that's been like known as big men or chiefs, and then moving on to statehoods and kings and pharaohs and other people that we'll get into later on. Now, going forward though as well, also in turn, somewhere along the line, what also occurred is the origin of complex religion, right? Now, we don't really know what came first, government or religion. No one's really positive, but we do know that the both of them began to kind of originate around the same time period. Now, complex religions are going to result mainly from old ideas being exemplified by some of those Paleolithic people, right? When me and Mr. Mathern and Mr. Wooderson used to be Paleolithic, used to be nomadic, used to be hunter-gatherers, if one of us died, a kind of symbol of our religious values was we would bury the dead. And we would sometimes bury them with their belongings, thinking that they might be able to take them to some type of plane or afterlife, right? So civilizations, though, continue to actually lurch forward because civilizations, we believe, arose around 5,000 years ago. Complex civilizations, anyway. Now, don't write this now, but this seems like a long time ago, right? Civilization kind of coming up a long time ago, about 5,000 years ago, seems like a long time. But keep this in mind. The Earth is 4 billion years old, right? And if it's 4 billion years old, Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what we are today, arose around 40,000 years ago. Their ancestors are only about 100,000 years old. So humans in general are all coming from one similar continent, and also in the grand scape of time, if you thought of human history, or if you thought of the history of the planet, 4 billion years, as a football field, the amount of time that humans have been involved in that history scape is the size of a blade of grass before the opposite end zone. Like, that's how small we are in this grand scheme of, like, Earth in general, right? So, and also, going backwards as well, when you're talking about 40,000 years ago, people rising up, Homo sapiens sapiens are going to originate out of Africa, okay? So the very first people ever to be originated in all of history were actually of African descent, coming out of what we believe to be sub-Saharan Africa, as in below the Sahara. Okay, and we can actually we believe actually on the scientific perspective that we can trace all of our genetics back to one person throughout history, known as mitochondrial Eve. We all actually share one genome in our DNA structure that all is shared by one original person, mitochondrial Eve, right? So the very first mother of the very first Homo sapien sapien, right? Very, very cool, right? But originating out of Africa, and then they would eventually migrate through other areas, right? And don't write this down, but this course is mostly our story, man's story, Homo sapiens sapiens story, from early civilizations to the gifts that they now endowed upon us today, right? That we use all the time. We're going to be talking a lot like the Greeks were a culture, how have they affected us? The Romans were a culture, how have they affected us? Absolutists in Europe during the 1600s, how have they affected us? What did they push out of our governments? Why do we exist the way that we do now, right? That is the big thing about this class, okay? So the very first humans, also known as hominids, don't write any of this, but this is just something else we'll talk about in a second, are known as hominids, right? Humans, every Homo sapien is a hominid, but not every hominid is a Homo sapien, if you understand what I'm saying. Hominid is just man, okay? We believe that hominids rose up around 3 to 4 million years ago with Australopithecus, all right? So, and they eventually are going to spread all over the world through migration and through extreme settlement, okay? Now, here's the thing, though. As they begin to start these settlements, there are 6 characteristics of a civilization. One of them being concentration, a group of people living in large groups in one area. Another big thing of a civilization is a distinct religious structure, as in having gods, priests, tribute was a big thing as well. Taxation of goods for the religious community was a very, very big important piece to early civilizations. Political and military structure is very big. Bureaucracy, armed military forces, things like that. Social classes is another very important characteristic of a civilization. And the other 2 at the very bottom are super important. Writing and record keeping, because recorded history began with civilizations. We can't study anything if they haven't actually created either writing or artifacts that we have to analyze. And the other big thing is artistic and intellectual activity, okay? So showing artistic and intellectual activity is a very important thing because it gives us a marker on where to start when we're studying these people. Then we can discover their writing systems, and we can kind of try to understand their society better through their writing systems if we can decipher that. And then going forward, we can understand their social classes, and then we can understand their political and military structure through their writing. So all these things are required for a civilization to necessarily exist, right? And we're going to start this understanding of civilizations in the ancient Near East, Southwest Asia, to be specific, when we begin talking about this area, known as the Fertile Crescent, and how it's kind of ironic that Western civilizations kind of began sort of out of what is now considered an Eastern area. So we're going to start there on your next day in class, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Y'all have a good one. I'll see you then.